Hello, my name is Jen Kirby. I'm a foreign and national security reporter at Vox, and I'm here today to help moderate this discussion about the future of intelligence sharing hosted by the Center for European Policy Analysis. We have a panel of really distinguished guests who will be talking about intelligence sharing, which is all the more important as we've seen given what is happening in Ukraine. That, of course, means intelligence sharing among allies and partners in NATO, but also maybe a little bit less traditionally, the public sharing of intelligence, which we've seen has shaped the narrative of the conflict and helped to counter disinformation. So it's clear these are all very important things, but there's always room for improvement and adaptation, especially as these threats shift and change, both for the NATO, but also beyond and the rest of the world. And so we're hoping today will be a lively discussion on where NATO allies are succeeding on intelligence, but also what are the future challenges of intelligence moving forward for the United States and its partners. And so with that, I will introduce our panelists. We'll go one by one. We'll start with Stephen Horrell. He is a senior fellow at the Transatlantic Defense and Security Program at the Center for European Policy Analysis. He is a former naval intelligence officer who served as the director of intelligence at Joint Intelligence Operations Center Europe Analytics Center at RAF Molesworth from 2012 to 2015, which is quite a mouthful, and I'm sure he can explain a little bit more what he did. But Steve, I'd love to hear from you about what your impressions are of how intelligence sharing has been used in the war in Ukraine so far.
Yeah, thank you very much, Jen. And you noted I was working at Jack, less of a mouthful, Jack Molesworth. That's Commander U.S. European Command's Intelligence Analysis and Production Center. So working for EUCOM's J2, I was fortunate to lead a team of 300 really smart, really talented people. And if you notice the dates, that was the last two times that Putin's Russia invaded Ukraine, with the illegal annexation of Crimea and the start of the Russian-led separatists' adventures in the Donbass in eastern Ukraine. So looking at that, I think it's important to note as we look at Ukraine being now in this war with Russia, that one of the things the West has been able to do has been to push intelligence to them. The hardware that we've pushed, security assistance, and as well humanitarian assistance from cross borders in Poland, Romania, and elsewhere have been important, but we've also been pushing intelligence to them. So the Ukrainian armed forces have put up a fantastic fight, and hopefully some of that intelligence sharing has been valuable to them in doing that. So the example I've given before, obviously we're not telling them anything about a 40-mile-long convoy stranded on their own territory, but hopefully what Western intelligence can do is help them prioritize their decisions, their targeting, and their choices operationally against those. And then the other thing hopefully that we can do is provide them what's over the horizon, what's coming up to the Russian border with Ukraine next, or are forces moving from farther afield within Russia to Ukraine. So it's an important thing that I know U.S. officials have confirmed without details that we're sharing intelligence. I think the UK has likewise confirmed that with the Ukrainians, but as well other NATO allies, specifically the ones in the eastern part of the alliance, also have good intel value from them having the geometry, the geography, the collection access, and the familiarity with Russia and Russia as a threat. So hopefully Ukraine's getting all those feeds, and that in addition to the hardware, that's also assisting in their fight.
Thank you. And next we have Admiral Michael Rogers. He's a senior advisor with the Brunswick Group, advising on issues of cybersecurity, geopolitics, technology, intelligence, among other issues. But he previously served as the commander of U.S. Cyber Command and as the director of the U.S. National Security Agency. Admiral Rogers, we're so grateful to have you here. I'm curious, one of the things ahead of this war was going to be the use of cyber warfare against Ukraine and potentially against its allies. And we haven't necessarily seen that. And I'm wondering if that is a success of intelligence or what, or if we just haven't seen it yet for other reasons. And I'm curious how you think about that.
First, I would say, look, there's a lot going on in cyber in Ukraine, Russia, and elsewhere. And look, the yardstick traditionally we use when assessing cyber is we look for the catastrophic knockout blow that physically knocks something down, internet connectivity, power infrastructure, rail functionality. The measure of success that we always look for is something catastrophic that knocks out a significant component of capability for days, weeks, even months. So I try to remind people, look, that's not what you're seeing play out so far in the Ukraine. You should not use that then as an assessment of, well, cyber really hasn't had any impact, or it really hasn't been significant. That's just not really the case. I think it highlights a couple of things to me. Number one, the Russians made some strategic choices prior to the actual invasion on the 24th of February. Among those choices to me in cyber were, this is going to be over pretty quickly. We're going to need to use this infrastructure ourselves once we assume control of a significant portion of Ukraine. Let's not degrade it. Let's not destroy it, because we're going to need to use it ourselves. And I think they just underestimated how long it was going to take. I think they are also mindful of, if we really need to degrade, deny, or destroy cyber connectivity or network functionality, look, we're in the middle of a kinetic fight right now. And if it means we're going to drop a bomb or a missile on a switching center, on a server farm, we can do that vice doing cyber. I think it also highlights now, almost, we're coming up, it's hard to believe, over 45 days into this physical confrontation on the ground in Ukraine. It also highlights the challenges of how do you execute cyber activity against a determined, prepared adversary. And Ukraine is determined and prepared with respect to cybersecurity and cyber defense. And so we're showing, I always used to try to remind our own nation's leadership, look, particularly against a prepared adversary, significant, high profile, high impact cyber activity takes weeks and months to execute, particularly in the face of a really well-positioned, well-informed adversary. And that's been part of the role of intelligence here. How do we make sure that our Ukrainian partners have knowledge and insight that allows them to make smarter choices, from what they're doing on the battlefield to the strategic choices they are making with respect to negotiations and other things with respect to Russia, but also in terms of the tactical level activities of cyber. How do we make sure they, using their own resources, as well as the intelligence that's being shared with them, how can they generate better knowledge about what the Russians are doing in cyber? How can they anticipate that activity? And how can they forestall it? And clearly, 45 plus days into this, you got to give them high marks. The Russians, even now, as they have turned to cyber more aggressively, the Russians are not having the impact in cyber as well that they had hoped.
So interesting. Thank you. Finally, we have John Cipher. He's the co-founder and CEO of Spycraft Entertainment and a foreign affairs and intelligence expert who had a decades-long career in the Central Intelligence Agency's National Clandestine Services. And John, I'm curious, we always think of intelligence as something that secrets and your experience about keeping secrets, but what we've seen in the war with Ukraine is a very public sharing of intelligence about Russia's war plans, particularly by the US government, but other allies and partners like the UK. And how do you see this public use of intelligence playing out in the war so far?
Well, sure. I applaud the intelligence community for taking such a proactive role in sharing information publicly. I think it's had an important and a positive impact. I do think there's some areas of concern that we can get into. I mean, it's obviously not a natural and comfortable place culturally, and the White House and the intelligence community will have to be thoughtful how they weigh the risks and stuff going forward. I mean, obviously, I think the use of public intelligence early on was to deter Putin. That was the early intent of the release, and obviously that didn't work. But I think it has been really valuable in coalescing allies at really a crucial time. It gave a common situational awareness to everybody. A lot of the leaders, probably in Europe and others, were hesitant to believe Putin would attack. And by providing regular real-time intelligence, I think it helped prepare the international community, and it allowed Biden to pull together really a strong coalition. There's a few things I worry about. I just mentioned them, but we can talk about them later. Is one, I worry about a lot. There's a lot of talk now about how the U.S. is finally playing in the information war. I got to be a little careful with this. I mean, I think communicating with and sharing with partners, sharing intelligence is one thing, but the information war almost suggests what the Russians do, which is using disinformation as a tool. And frankly, the United States shouldn't and can't really play that game in the same way. We're using what we believe to be true information. We can't have the White House trying to play psyops games in the public sphere. There's some issues around, I think, the sort of changing nature of intelligence collection that have allowed this to happen too, right? Now there's radically increased use of big data, growth of commercial overhead imagery, a lot of OSINT, open source intelligence that's out there that may allow the community to take information that they know to be true, to be secret, and then layer it with a lot of open source data to share with partners and others to sort of use it here. And then the last thing I would mention, there's some others, but is we're sort of in an unusual situation, I think, with Bill Burns as the CIA director and with the DNI, who's had a lot of experience in the community in the White House. These are experienced practitioners, they're mature consumers, they're senior administration officials, they're pros, right? And they can carefully judge the potential risks and gains. However, if we set this standard now of publicly using secret intelligence, we have to think about how a future president or someone who's less professional or less into this world might use that and might use it as a partisan weapon. I think the previous administration may very well have, if they thought this was okay, they might use it sort of for their own political purposes, as opposed to in the way we're seeing it be used now.
That's interesting. I'd actually like to open it up and hear from both Admiral Rogers and Steve about how they see this as well, given that secrets is also your business, particularly the decision-making that went into this this process. Admiral Rogers, I'll turn to you.
Sure. So, as a guy with, during my time, John Brennan and Gina and I, being in the Oval and with the president of the DNI, talking about these kinds of issues and other scenarios, Syria and other places. First of all, I remind everybody, in the end, this is a policy decision. This is a policy. This is a decision that is driven at a presidential level. It is executed by the DNA and the agencies, but there shouldn't be any doubt. This is ultimately a political decision. So the Biden team deserves a lot of credit here for their willingness to do this, as does the community, the intelligence community, for their willingness to execute this and to show you the benefit of this. The second point I would make is remember, this is not a blank check that says all intelligence generated by the US structure goes to Ukraine. There are specific policy directions here about what type of information, how it was acquired, how it is shared with Ukraine, and in some cases, how it is used. There's very specific direction there. So no one should be thinking that this just means the decision was made, we're just going to open the gates and everything is flowing. It doesn't really work that way. I think it's also a reminder to everybody, look, not all when it comes to the biggest factor that shapes these kinds of decisions, as John and Steve well know, they experience this their entire working life as intelligence professionals. It is all about a debate about what are the trade-offs between the value generated by the release and the potential risk to sources, that you're compromising your ability to continue to generate this kind of information over time. Because you're not just worried about your ability to provide insight at a particular time and place, you worry about your ability to generate insight over time across a breadth of issues. And sometimes the capability, sometimes the source you use for one particular thing also has much broader application. So you are always concerned about, I want to provide as much insight as I can. I want to help policymakers and operational commanders be better informed so they can make smarter choices. But I am mindful that I also have a mission to continue to provide this kind of value over time. And so there's always this decision about, are you going to lose that? The last point I would make is not all intelligence disciplines are the same here. But, as the director of NSA, the largest intelligence organization in the free world, if we're honest, but what I used to tell our team is, guys, our sources are primarily technical. We penetrate opponents' communications, their digital data links, their radar systems. Our approach is primarily technical. And that means we're going to gain access, we're going to lose access, but I always felt pretty good. Look, we have a high probability of regaining it. I also try to remind them, look, for our human intelligence teammates like the CIA, there is a human at the end of all this. And the price of potentially compromising that source is that human is imprisoned, tortured, executed. Their family faces those same things. I said, look, guys, we need to remember that not all intelligence is the same, and the risk to sources takes on very different calculus based on the nature and the dynamic. And so I just want to remind everybody, look, it's intelligence is not just generic, it's all the same. But I know Steve probably has a perspective here as well.
Yeah, thanks, Aaron. Since, Admiral, both you and John cited that it's always about a trade-off of risks and benefits, I just want to make that unanimous. It's always got to be a decision-making process, and thanks, Admiral, for that. Really putting a face on the sources and methods, right? You talk about we don't want to risk sources and methods, and that's why we don't turn this over. But yeah, in some cases, that's people and their families and lives, et cetera. So again, in all these, it's about the decision process of what we're going to share, as you pointed out, and why we're going to do it. To what end are we going to do it? So, I guess taking this declassification and public release, which, most intelligence folks don't think of as intelligence sharing. You got the intel sharing to Ukraine. I'm sure there's a decision process for how much more are we pushing into the NATO envelope rather than just US only or Five Eyes. And then there's also, I think, as we talked about coalescing the international, we're both within Horrell, like NATO, the alliance, feeding to many allies to get cohesion, but also, how much do we feed other partners? So Finland and Sweden. Obviously, there's a long-standing cooperative interoperability relationship with NATO and with those two currently neutral countries. But how, as they've reached their decision, or apparently have reached their decisions to join, how much of that have we been providing them on a bilateral basis to make sure they've got the right picture as they make their decisions. And then the other hard part, Finland and Sweden, obviously are at one level, but, say NATO were involved in a full-on conflict in the Black Sea region, how do we handle Moldova or Georgia or other, acknowledged partners? It's down in black and white on paper, but not alliance members with those. So, potentially, I think this very public declassification and release, does seem like somewhat groundbreaking, but I think that the important thing is that we make sure and kind of capture maybe all those things in an umbrella of the wider use of intelligence information in these diplomatic and public information channels, and make sure that we're making those decisions in the future with some sort of rigor, right? That we're not shooting from the hip, or, I shuddered when John mentioned, potentially political gains within our country. But, do we as a community of intelligence professionals need to kind of put that together in a school of thought doctrine, decision matrix for how we do that in the future?
Hey, Jen, one comment, something that Steve said I thought was very important. Remember, there's 30 nations at NATO. The US, we're just one of 30. And not all 30 of those nations have come to the same conclusions with respect to intelligence sharing. So it's worth remembering that this not only is specific within our nation, but every nation within the alliance and the broader set of nations that are involved with the sanctions effort. They are all making their own decisions based on their own calculus. And so this is not uniform here by any stretch of the imagination.
Absolutely.
And yeah, doing anything at 30 is challenging. And then especially when you get to some things that are, frankly, an intellectual call, and then other things that are their own national interests with their sources and methods.
To the point, and I think John made this point earlier, that the public intelligence did help kind of coalesce allies who might otherwise have come to different conclusions, or 30 countries are working toward different things. And I'm wondering if, how the response has been to the Ukraine war so far can offer any insights into potentially how intelligence sharing is working among the alliance. What are we seeing now that offers clues of how that process is working and potentially where we can build? John, I'll start with you.
Sure. I think there's a distinction between the regular intelligence sharing and then this public use of intelligence. On the intelligence sharing, I'm pretty confident. CIA has been doing this state to state forever, for decades and decades. And so, our embassy in Kiev has been working with the Ukrainians for years. There's a long series, there's trust built up there. We've been sharing intelligence. It changes over time, and as that trust changes or issues change. There's ways of giving intelligence that sort of protects sources. There's ways to ramp that up and ramp that down. That's something that's been done for a long time, and I'm sure it's being done now, whether it's being done electronically or being done in person. That kind of thing is going on. It's going on with all partners. And of course, in NATO, that's worked through the military, there's a long held way of sharing intelligence and information, and it all depends on what people's specific needs are. On the use of the public, I think that's also been very, very valuable politically. But again, there's some dangers there, right? I mean, when this first started to happen and people saw it publicly, almost every media organization said the same thing. Well, what about Iraq? You guys put out false information in Iraq. What you're saying now is probably not true, which was frustrating to hear, but we got to think about that, right? So it's been positive so far. And I think the White House is trying to put out accurate intelligence, right? We can't put out disinformation. We can't use intelligence to fool the American people. It's against the law for intelligence agencies to do that. But we could conceivably put out something we believe to be true that turns out not to be true, like what happened with the WMD fiasco around the Iraq war. And there's a danger there if we start to do that then will create sort of distrust in these same places where the sharing of information has created, actually excellent working together and excellent trust. And then the other last thing I would just bring up at some point is using intelligence publicly also does allow adversaries over time to try to use that. In the spy world, in the espionage world, we worry about people use what we used to call bury a meal. If a other service believes it has sources in its midst, they can try to put out false information so that they can then determine based on what they hear back where it came from. And so those are a few things we got to think about in this area as we move forward.
And, Jen, the only thing I would add, the proliferation of commercially generated information, which had it been generated by the government, we'd be calling it intelligence, but the proliferation of commercially generated information, to me, has had two major impacts. Number one, it's made broader declassification much easier, in part because now we can mask sources and message to some extent by potentially saying, hey, this could have been commercially generated. It's well within the range of capabilities now of the commercial sector. So it's increased the willingness, I only speak from my old world, certainly on the technical side, it's increased the comfort level with, hey, there are alternatives that we can use to help mask sources and methods. The second thing I think that this proliferation of commercially generated intelligence or information has had is the verification idea. You're able to see intelligence released by governments, the United States and others, that are involved in sanction activity and support to Ukraine. And as you have already mentioned, as we saw in Iraq, you had some people arguing, well, hey, is this disinformation? Is it inaccurate? Are you lying or creating a story or an image designed to support your own particular viewpoint? We didn't have this same level of independent verification in the Iraq and the Afghan scenarios, for example. It just didn't exist to the same capacity level. We had some of it from a technical standpoint, but it wasn't there from a capacity level. You're not having those same issues. I'm struck by, now that may change over time, but 45 plus days into this, we are not having debates about, was that US or intelligence generated information valid, accurate? We're not having that discussion to the same extent, in part because we've got this independent means now to verify much of what government sources are publicly acknowledging. I think that's really interesting. Those are two interesting trends for the future. But I know, Steve, you probably want to add something.
Yeah, just following up on that token. So again, the decision to release a fact statement without saying, and here's our evidence in great detail with all the images and circles and arrows, you can make that, and then 3,000 people on Twitter will go, oh yeah, there it is. That's what I saw in the commercial imagery that I pay a couple bucks for a subscription to. With the incident with the Black Sea flagship Moskva and sinking, there's a Twitter account that was tracking some ham radio, tracking them and following the Morse. And that's potentially always been happening, but in this day and age, they've got it's not just one person who happened to tune into that frequency and got it in their basement in Lima, Ohio. It's now out for everyone in the world. So that open source in the sense of the publicly available information definitely makes a difference. What's really hard is to get that done. That's potentially as the U.S. and NATO look at how do we best do open source intel in publicly available information. It becomes almost anecdotal. So you need, and probably AI and machine learning to comb through all this information to get what we would consider an operational picture or tactically useful picture. But in that narrative battle, just what's out there anecdotally on hundreds and more Twitter accounts makes that public release task easier, as long as you're telling the truth.
That's really interesting about the sort of publicly available information, and how it's sort of helping to bolster the intelligence released by governments. And I wonder, given that this seems to be sort of part of the landscape moving forward, that we are going to be able to have things that are available publicly that could potentially bolster and help our own sort of intelligence collection, both in the United States and among NATO partners, for example. What is your sense of how successfully NATO partners and NATO allies specifically are sharing and analyzing and sort of fusing the information that's available publicly to supplement what they are gathering through their intelligence agencies? Is that an area that NATO needs to improve on? Is that a place where there could be even more potential for cooperation and growth? Steve, I'll start with you and then move from there.
Yeah, thanks, Jen. I think if you want to look at how to optimize, improve NATO intelligence, so NATO as an alliance, as 30 members working together, how should NATO invest collectively? I think it'd be a mistake to try and do some pale imitation of what Five Eyes has, right? So what we've got in the technical capabilities is there, and it gets fed down into NATO. And as I said, the Estonia, Latvia, Lithuania, Poland, Romania on the border, they're getting some good collection and feeding that into NATO. But collectively, what could NATO do as 30 to improve? I think that's definitely fertile ground. So figure out, hey, how can we purchase all of that publicly available data? How can we invest in the right tools, AI or whatever else, to analyze it? And then you've got something that's investable, but then also somewhat scalable, right? So whether it's each country taking a slice and feeding into the collective, or something purchased as NATO, like the RQ4 Alliance ground surveillance system, that's definitely, I think, an area that can help NATO intelligence get better overall.
Yeah, and the only thing I would add is remember the way intelligence works in NATO. The alliance itself has, at the Brussels and at the command level, the alliance itself has very limited independent intelligence capacity or capability. The model relies on the insights and knowledge generated by the 30 member nations, which are then shared, fused, and analyzed to present senior makers within the alliance, whether they be policy individuals at the North Atlantic Council or whether they be operational commanders at the tactical execution level. It's the fusing that creates the intelligence picture. So I think Steve makes an important point. There's both an individual national component to this about how each nation is looking at how it's going to maximize capabilities with respect to the application and maximization of open source intelligence, if you will, or insights generated commercially, knowledge and data generated commercially. But I think there's also a second discussion about, well, what's appropriate at the alliance level itself, at the higher level? What should the alliance be investing here? Because the alliance has chosen to invest in some capabilities over and above what the individual nations are doing. Cyber comes to mind, for example. There's a handful of others. the Alliance to date really hasn't gone down this route so much in the open source piece. I think that will be another source of discussion coming out of this conflict, as this highlights that there are some areas that the Alliance should look at increasing the level of investment capability and prioritization over and above what the 30 individual member nations are doing.
Is that a quick piece is that, that each individual nation has its own sort of expertise that sort of provides stuff that we can't provide. I know in CIA, for example, in human intelligence, some large percentage of the amount of intelligence reports we put out every year, say 70% or something like that, are from intelligence partners, are from liaison partners, are from the people we work with that understand their societies and things on the ground better than we do, that can give us things that we can't get. And we're seeing that in the open source thing. You see places like Bellingcat and others that have unique access. They have people on the ground that know how you get a ticket for speeding in Moscow and how they can take advantage of that. That's stuff that we wouldn't be able to automatically know, but they can use that data and pull it into a system that we can all then take advantage of. And so I think we're seeing that in Ukraine. Ukraine has incredible knowledge of the Russians. They've been attacked for years and years. They've had cyber attacks. They've had destabilization attacks. They've had subversion, all this stuff. They've been at war at least since 2014. So there's a lot of knowledge that they have that our sort of overarching thing can help them, with what they're doing. But the real knowledge is coming from people who are used to dealing with these things day to day.
And that sort of brings me to another question about intelligence sharing, not just within the alliance and the 30 members, but with partners, NATO partners, like, for example, Finland and Sweden. NATO has intelligence relationships with them. They are not officially members of NATO yet, TBD on what happens there. But of course, we're also sharing intelligence now with Ukraine, although there are limits to what we are sharing. But as you mentioned, John, these countries maybe outside the alliance may have experience on Russia, but on other issues that could help supplement NATO's capabilities. And I'm curious if you guys could speak a bit to the relationship and how intelligence fits in with our NATO partners, not necessarily our allies. John, I'll start with you since you made me think of the question.
Well, the Admiral and Steve probably may have a better idea how it's done at sort of the NATO Brussels level. But for the CIA, it's always done partner to partner. So I guarantee there's people in Helsinki right now sharing information, that have built up trust over years and years with our partners in Finland, and the same is happening in Sweden, the same is happening in Tallinn and in Latvia and in Riga and all these places. And so it's, those relationships are there. That information is shared with the partners who then decide what to bring into the NATO system.
And I would only say SIGINT slightly different. Just given history, the Five Eyes structure started with SIGINT is the initial enabling relationship, for example. In the SIGINT world, we not only do bilats with every nation, but we have also created a collective mechanism for almost every member of NATO, where quite frankly, we're just so integrated with each other. That's why I said earlier in all this, remember, every intelligence discipline is a little different for a variety of reasons. There's a slightly different approach because there's a slightly different risk calculus, and there's a slightly different broader political context that shapes the dynamics in some cases of intelligence relationships. I would tell you, I was looking at every nation, for example, that is currently enacting sanction regimes. And I thought to myself, in my previous life, we had a direct relationship with every single one of them, which again, I thought was part of the power of the US intelligence structure. In some ways, it's an extension of the broader political dynamics and political relationships that we have as a nation. And those relationships we have at an intelligence level, they really not only assist with execution in crisis scenarios like Ukraine, but quite frankly, they also serve to create cohesion, stability, and in the integration of information on a day-to-day basis, quite frankly, that when you have to flex in crisis, you've got the structures in place, you've got the relationships, you're used to intelligence and information sharing, you have a sense of what each partner's capabilities are. Because as John said, you always try to maximize the capabilities and values that everybody can provide. And there are many areas where, quite frankly, non-US partners are going to be more valuable, are going to have a better perspective, are going to have better access, are going to have better insights. And a good intelligence professional never forgets that. It isn't always about the big old USA being the smartest, the biggest. That does not get us where we need to be.
Yeah, absolutely. Every one of those allies and then even the non-alliance partners have something that they're bringing to the table. But one C story sort of as a potential caution. When I was at Jack Molesworth and we were watching one of these major Russian exercises. So I think last fall we had Zapad 22. So we've wanted to go hard on watching the exercise to flex ourselves. We called reservists forward from the States to Molesworth. We were using reservists in place in the U.S. And the intelligence engagements folks at headquarters got a 6, 7, 8 country, alliance members, but sort of a coalition of the willing within the alliance. We set up fusion cells, and every single one of them then also came and said, "Could we do this bilaterally also?" And frankly, I was out of analysts. So the relationships were there. Everyone was sharing that. Make sure we're doing it smart all the way around.
I guess these are where we've had success in intelligence, but obviously the war in Ukraine has we're seeing a war that we're familiar with, but we've also been talking or have talked in the intelligence and national security community about hybrid threats, cyber, of course, being a big one. And I'm wondering what are some of the areas of weakness for intelligence sharing or for even for intelligence collection right now for some of these broader threats, particularly within NATO. Whoever wants to take this one first can jump in. Maybe I see Steve is first for me, so I'll start with you.
Okay, thanks. Yeah, so and part of that is what do we mean when we say hybrid war or gray zone war? So in most cases, it's those actions by the adversary that are trying to be disruptive but falling short of force-on-force conflicts. That includes a lot of things, as you mentioned, cyber. And I won't try to talk too much about cyber while Admiral Rogers is on the line. But that narrative battle, the information versus misinformation, disinformation, as John highlighted earlier there, I think that's one area where both public release, but also the sharing with allies and partners can have great value. And I think, there's catchphrase moving around lately, deterrence by detection. And so some of that is about conventional forces. And hey, we see what you're doing on the border. You better stop and back down. Same thing with misinformation and narratives. As you can get the truth out there sooner, you can pre-bunk rather than debunk and getting yourself into an explaining is losing. Another big aspect of that hybrid gray zone warfare. So looking back to the 2014 annexation of Crimea, it's the deniability. Most people looking at pictures with experience knew that those little green men were very, very Russian. So it's how can you get that out there quickly and take away the adversary's hybrid gray zone deniability, which in their case, they're using that deniability as a strength within, within that sort of limited kind of warfare. So definitely paths to combat the various aspects of hybrid as well.
And what I would add is, look, hybrid warfare in its dynamic and the intelligence challenge of providing knowledge and insight to help commanders and policymakers deal with it is also challenged by, we don't have a one size fits all to the level of risk that we have with respect to how we share different aspects of intelligence. So example, on the defensive side of cybersecurity, we were always very comfortable with working very aggressively with almost every nation in terms of helping them generate better cyber defense, about us sharing capabilities, intelligence, knowledge, expertise, often working side by side. I mean, the US, both between Cyber Command and other organizations, we deployed capability into Ukraine pretty immediately as Crimea was unfolding in February of 2014, because we were very concerned about the cyber piece. And to a point John had made, my comment to the team at the time was, this is a great learning laboratory for us. Not only can we help an important partner here, But look at what we can learn. These guys deal with the Russians and Russian cyber activity every day at a level that is different for us. The Russians much more aggressive offensively in cyber, for example, historically in Ukraine than they willing to have been in other areas. On the other hand, offensive cyber capability, hey, this is something we hold very tightly. We are just not going to share this broadly with nations. And that's also true within the NATO arena. It's not one size fits all. Nuclear is another area. Even within imagery, for example, there are some capabilities in imagery you just don't feel comfortable broadly disseminating. So everything's a case-by-case basis. The nature of the capability, the risk of its potential compromise, the risk to sources, the concern that might others gain knowledge about how they themselves could generate similar capability, similar expertise, or how might they defeat our capabilities in this area. We didn't want to lose that advantage. So it's not a one size fits all. One of the challenges, last thought for me on this one of the challenges in particular for hybrid warfare was in some areas, it got into areas that were either really sensitive for us from an intelligence perspective or particularly cyber. We just didn't want to lose that edge. But quite frankly, it also, particularly because the information dynamic is so important in hybrid warfare as a democracy, the internal discussions that we would have, that I participated with the White House leadership and others have done through the course of their careers, where it was, look, we need to be very measured, very concerned here. We are a democracy in which the First Amendment of our Constitution is about freedom of speech, not the Fifth Amendment, not the 20th Amendment, the first one, because we wanted to make sure we highlighted up front, this is foundational to our concept as a nation. And so those kinds of dynamics, I think, help to make hybrid warfare a little challenging in some areas from an intelligence support perspective. But I know John's got a perspective here.
I was going to say on the those two guys, they probably still have security clearances. I haven't for a while, so I can guess. I can do a wild ass guess that they probably know better and they can't. One of them is, I would bet a lot of what we see as Russian failures in this war have to do with the U.S. use of intelligence and use of its cyber capabilities and other capabilities. Some shared with Ukraine, some probably not. That's just my guess. And I've seen just how incredible and how good our intelligence professionals can be when they need to be. And then on the weakness side, there's, when you're dealing with Russia, it's tough. Russia has an incredibly aggressive offensive capability, but a very, very serious defensive capability in trying to stop anybody from collecting intelligence there. As you know, for human collectors, it's really, really difficult to operate in Moscow. You're under surveillance constantly. Your house is bugged. Your house has video. They follow everybody. They question everybody. It's a really hard place to run human sources. And then on the disinformation side, they have the advantage. Essentially, they can lie and use disinformation at will, and they can use it even if it goes back into their own country, because they test these things out first at home to try to keep any potential political opposition at bay and repressed. And so when it comes to the idea of use of public information and things, the Russians can spread disinformation and push it. We can't play that game really. From early days in our republic, the thought that intelligence could use disinformation was fine in the day where you could do something in India and it would never make its way back into the United States. Nowadays, if the U.S. government tries to put out false information and it makes its way into the U.S. media chain, that's a no-no. And so we're a little bit of a disadvantage. We have to use true information in the public sense, while we use all these other capabilities, perhaps secretly.
To the point of sort of we do have to be careful. I suppose we can't necessarily use the same tools that our adversaries can do. But one thing is, in many ways, we've seen NATO's importance or necessity has reemerged at the war in Ukraine, and the alliance is coming up on a pretty big date in a few months with the 2022 strategic concept. It will be sort of a redefining moment in many ways for the alliance. And I'm curious what you are all looking for from that process, particularly when it comes to intelligence sharing. Are you looking for an expanded focus? Are you looking for new tools? What are you looking for there as NATO kind of goes through these processes? Steve, I'll start with you.
Yeah, thanks. I think I'm glad personally not to be in NATO headquarters in Brussels right now, because you had, of course, with the initial third invasion, a lot of work, a lot of spin, a lot of churn, and now I think that they're turning there too. Okay, what are the lessons to be learned from this Russia-Ukraine war? And I think the intelligence sharing will be a part of that. I hope so. And again, these concepts of one, optimizing NATO intelligence. So again, optimizing what each of the 30 members brings to it, but then what can NATO do at the collective level to be value add for that? So again, if we're talking big data, publicly available information, can NATO set the standards, or can NATO start developing, providing some specific tools that then each of the 30 members can use? So I hope the Ukraine conflict and the intelligence challenges and successes that we've seen, again, the publicly available information, the open source that's out there, but also the sharing and the public release will be taken on board. And then hopefully they've got the time. And again, a lot of hard work for everyone at headquarters there in Brussels in the meantime, but for those lessons to be taken on board for the strategic compass, for other things in the NATO 2030 concept.
And for me, look, the current head of intelligence for NATO is an American, Dave Cattler, a good friend. I know he is focused. I mean, I've talked to him within the last month on this, but to me, two things. The first is the future to me is all about integration. We just cannot afford these stovepipes where, hey, Intel works by itself and then at some point comes together with a broader set of inputs, operational, political, et cetera. Secondly, I hope the alliance team is stepping back and asking themselves, so what are the appropriate investments and capabilities in intelligence we need to make in an alliance-centric level versus what can we be doing and harnessing the capabilities of 30 nations that all have different capabilities, different focuses, different expertise, and different geography, for example. Lastly, it's not one that comes to mind, but another thing I hope they're doing, we've tended to focus on Russia and NATO in this conversation, but one of the things that really interests me, so for example, what are the Chinese taking away from all of this? What are the insights? What is the perspective? What do they think are the relevant themes? And what are the long-term implications for intelligence broadly, but specifically for China as it is figuring out its way in the world, its role moving forward? Man, I hope we're spending a lot of time thinking about how can we generate knowledge and insight about what their takeaways are from all of this.
Yeah, I don't have as good of an answer because CIA doesn't tend to play at the NATO level in a serious way, but it's a smaller organization and it does need to invest in Europe and in China and these sort of the issues that are coming up here. We've spent so many years on terrorism, which is a different sort of thing to focus on the way we do work. And so we need to reinvest in the languages and the skills to work and support European allies, as well as, like the Admiral suggested, with China.
I can jump real quickly on the China point, and excellent point. But there's multiple facets to it. So China has been attempting to make inroads into Central and Eastern Europe with as a part of their Belt and Road Initiative 16+1. So how does NATO collectively and as individual member nations approach that? I think the outcome of this war, and I'm all in favor of Ukraine winning, because a win for Ukraine is a win for the U.S. and NATO. But how do China and Russia's relationship and how that's expressed beyond the two of them turn into? But then also, if we move past this, how does the West, the transatlantic community, address the Indo-Pacific and the challenges that are there? Will it be NATO? Will it be the EU? Will it be coalitions of the willing, et cetera? And I think there's ideas in there for NATO 2030 and the strategic compass as well.
I think that sort of brings up to sort of the broader challenges that beyond NATO and beyond Russia, there are huge, national security and intelligence challenges, and obviously China being one of the big questions or concerns. And I'm wondering, sort of zooming out a bit, what do you think are the biggest, intelligence challenges for the United States and its partners? moving forward. And, you know, as much as we can tell from where we are now. Admiral Rogers, I'll start with you.
Well, pretty broad question. I just pick a couple specific things. The first, remember, Europe has a history of collective security and has had an alliance formal mechanism in place literally for 70 years, 70 plus years. There is no equivalent history in many other parts of the world. Certainly, if you just look at Asia and the Indo-Pacific region, there is no history of collective security. There are no standing alliance or collaborative mechanisms that span 30 nations. It's much smaller subsets. So I am mindful of, hey, what has worked with respect from an intelligence perspective in terms of a strategy? What has worked vis-a-vis Russia, guys, is a little tougher to try to replicate in other areas of the world. That means we got to think differently. We got to figure out what strategies for intelligence support, for example, are going to work in an Asia context that might not work in a European one, number one. Number two, I hope that we can use this intelligence sharing and the information dynamic. I think that's a really powerful tool coming out of this. And I'm hoping that we're going to be having a dialogue, and I'm sure we are, with a broader set of nations around the world who are allies, partners, or potential partners to say, look, we need to be thinking now about how would we do this? Let's not wait until we're in the middle of a crisis to suddenly have a discussion about, is there a way we can share more intelligence with each other? I don't think really that's the time to be doing this. So I hope moving forward, we're having those discussions now. One last non sequitur, not related to the question, but I was thinking about it when John said something. The power of truth to me always was there's multiple ways for independent verification. The challenge for a lies-based strategy, it's really hard to come up with independent verification of your lie, particularly independent verification that's broadly trusted by others with a different focus, a different perspective. It's one of the reasons why I've always been a proponent. Truth is our strength. It is challenging. I acknowledge it. And it can be so frustrating at times when you are watching the other side just freaking lie through their teeth and you know it. And yet at times you can't always convince others in the world that, hey, that's a lie. Why are you buying that? Why are you endorsing that seemingly? But as frustrating as that can be, truth is always the most powerful strategy here to me. That's all I had for you.
I'll go, if you don't mind, next. First of all, I would like to focus on the fact that I think the intelligence community has done a really good job here. I mean, the intelligence community was set up, obviously, after Pearl Harbor to provide strategic warning. When Eisenhower came in, he said, the only thing he wanted from the new CIA was to provide 24-hour notice of a Soviet attack in Europe. And I think, in this case, we did what we were set up to do. The community did a great job here. But there are things that we need to really focus on moving forward. One of them, the Admiral already mentioned, integration and working better with partners. I think we all do that instinctually, but it certainly can be improved. Another one is counterintelligence. It's getting harder sometimes to do our job. Cyber attacks, cyber sophistication of adversaries is better and better. For on my part of the world where we're doing human espionage, that's getting harder and harder too. There's cameras everywhere. There's easier to collect big data from everybody's phones, from all themselves. When I first started, you could just get a fake passport and run around and spy. You can't do those kind of things anymore. And then the last one that just comes to mind is finding a way to integrate a lot of these open source tools that are out there. The intelligence community is going to have to look at what's available other than just secret intelligence that we can collect, so that we can refocus on those things that the intelligence community, only the intelligence community can do. We've got to be the real value add that can just do that one piece. But to be able to do those one piece well, we have to understand what's already out there. And there tends to be a culture in the intelligence community, maybe less so in NSA than there is in CIA, of being aware of what's out there and taking commercial and public things as seriously as we probably should. And I think that community needs to do a better job at that.
I will say that the biggest challenge we're looking at as an intelligence community is that we can't pick just one single challenge. So going back a decade when we first started talking about the Pacific Century or a pivot to Asia and the focus on the Indo-Pacific region, we learned pretty quickly then, again, with Putin's Russia's previous invasions of Ukraine, that, right, we can't either or. And the challenge is, how do we do it all? How do we look at a pacing threat of China and an acute threat coming from Russia, whether they get antsy after this Ukraine adventure or they're more dangerous in a chaotic collapse after that? We can't either or. We can't choose just one. We have to address all of them, and that comes down to resources. And then hopefully that's where the sharing, doing things smarter in a lot of ways, but most importantly, the share the burden and share the resource contribution with allies and partners everywhere will hopefully be part of how we do that smarter.
Thanks. Well, we are almost getting to the end of the panel. I just want to thank all of you, Stephen, John, Admiral Rogers, for participating in this event. And also thank you to the Center for European Policy Analysis for giving us this platform for a fantastic discussion. I will just leave it if anybody has any quick closing remarks, if you would like to volunteer, and then otherwise just thank you so much.
Hey, for me, I'd just like to double down on something John said. As an intelligence professional, I was in uniform for 37 years. Man, I am just very proud of what the team's doing today. I mean, they are really making a difference, and they are helping to save lives. They're helping policymakers make smarter decisions. They're helping military commanders on the ground in Ukraine make smarter choices. And they're doing it with integrity, honesty, and real professionalism. So for me, I just love seeing the team excel.
Man.